Dear viewers, hope you enjoyed the last lesson, wherein we discussed the meaning of international humanitarian law, which forms a part of international law of peace. In the second lesson, we will be tracing the origin and development of international humanitarian law. The central theme of this lesson is to brief the origin of international humanitarian law. The main objective of this lesson will be the study of origin and development along with the 4 Geneva Conventions. Therefore, it is necessary to briefly examine the evolution of that body of law. International humanitarian law, as the jus in bello or the laws of war is currently described, is imbued with particular sense of its history. Sometimes international lawyers locate international humanitarian law in a long history of codes of warfare that straddle different times and cultures. At other points, international lawyers might emphasize the contribution of Henry Dunant, who witnessed, as seen earlier, the Battle of Solferino and was inspired to create the International Committee of Red Cross, otherwise known as ICRC, and instigate the tradition of Geneva Conventions. These histories help to inform the current understanding of the nature and purpose of international humanitarian law. In this lesson, therefore, we will relate a different, shorter history of international humanitarian law. We will see how the term international humanitarian law was created, then fought for, and finally won in 1970s through propitious convergence of a range of different actors and interests. The new name represented as its adherents fully understood not just a shift in terminology but also a fresh approach to the jus in bello. It indicated a new field of law, an enlarged humanitarian law endowed with an appropriate array of humanitarian principles. The 1977 additional protocols to the Geneva Conventions were the repository of these principles. They held the outline of the new field. Yet, despite this accomplishment, international humanitarian law and the humanitarian understanding of the jus in bello remained controversial for almost 2 decades as states and legal commentators questioned the protocol's principles and authority. It was only in the very end of the 20th century that practitioners of international humanitarian law, following the example set by human rights organizations, suddenly accepted the authority of Additional Protocol 1 and with it a humanitarian vision of the jus in bello. This shift can be seen in both the newly confident use of the term international humanitarian law to describe all the laws of war and renovated understanding of the content of this law, an understanding that is exemplified in the changing interpretation of the principles of proportionality. This history that follows of how this change in the language and understanding of jus in bello came about shows that in what was a contested and contingent process. Moreover, it reveals that the contest for international humanitarian law was played out by a diffuse cast of actors which included both the conventional contributors to the international law and other less traditional, less acknowledged participants. As such, This history provides an explanation of how the important aspect of the paradigm shift from sovereignty to humanitarianism in international affairs was accomplished. At the same time, it also shows something about the nature of international humanitarian law itself by illustrating international humanitarian law's curious allocation of authority, its potential for change, its restrictions on variation. Now we will move on to the evolution of international humanitarian law. The beginning of humanitarian law was in 1864 with the first Geneva Convention, the Convention for the amelioration of the condition of the wounded in armies in the field. Influenced by one of the bloodiest battles of the 19th century in Solferino, Henri Dunant in 1862 published Un Souvenir de Solferino, a memory of Solferino. Dunant proposed that nations should form relief societies to provide care for the wounded in wartime. This laid down the foundation for the Geneva Conventions and led to the settlement of the International Red Cross. On 22 August 1864, 12 nations signed the first Geneva Convention, agreeing to guarantee neutrality to medical personnel, to expedite supplies for their use, and to adopt a special identifying emblem, which since 1870s has been Red Cross on a white background. Developing alongside the Geneva Conventions were the Hague Conventions created by states in order to govern the conduct of war. The Hague Conventions are various international treaties that emerged from the Hague Peace Conference in 1899 and 1907. At these international conferences, limitations on armaments, for example, a prohibition on the use of air bombs and chemical warfare and expansion of armed forces were proposed. The two conventions established a model for multilateral meetings to create international laws and subsequently influenced the formation of the League of Nations in 1919. The Geneva Protocol to Hague Convention is considered an addition to the Hague Convention, although not drafted in the Hague. This entered into force on 8 February 1928 and permanently banned the use of all forms of chemical and biological warfare. This was drafted following the use of mustard gas and similar agents in World War I and fears that such warfare in the future could lead to terrible consequences. The protocol has since been amended by the Biological Weapons Convention in 1972 and Chemical Weapons Convention in 1993. Hague Conventions, as opposed to the Geneva Conventions, which are concerned with the treatment of personnel and civilians, mainly detail the permitted conduct for war. The Geneva Conventions adopted prior to 1949 were concerned with the treatment of soldiers. Following the events of World War II, it was understood that the Convention for the Protection of Civilians in wartime was also crucial. The international humanitarian law is a branch of public international law, we all know. So consequently, it will take the characteristics of public international law. We are talking about features with reference to fact that the rules have been established by agreement between the states and not consensus of states having to respect and implement it as both the outcome and recipient of the rules. Speaking about the delimitation of the two branches of law, it must be observed that international law, that is public international law, applies in times of peace the rules governing the peaceful relationship between states, while international humanitarian law refers to the relation among states in times of armed conflicts, more precisely from the imposition of a state of conflict to restore peace. Studying the two branches of law, we can see alternatively that the rules of public international law prohibit mainly the war as the worst form of international aggression, while international humanitarian law requires it in the sense that in the absence of armed conflict of the war, it is not necessary to have an international humanitarian law. If there is no war, there is no necessity for international humanitarian law. In terms of applicability, public international law applies principle pacta sunt servanda, which means treaties entered in good faith must be executed in good faith. On the other hand, international humanitarian law applies the state of existence in extreme conditions, in conditions of maximum existential sovereignty, mentioning that the belligerent states are committed to the humanitarian conventions. Consequently, international humanitarian law is the branch of public international law based on humanism in conditions of violence. We believe that the international humanitarian law represents the minimum rules of civilization to the primitive barbaric tendencies. The rules established in international humanitarian law will remains as a testament to human will, control of force in the violent outburst with negative results on humans, property and environment. According to comprehensive definition, in our opinion, and certainly perfectible, the international humanitarian law can be defined as a set of rules of international law based on custom or convention designed to certain issues arising in international or non-international armed conflict situations. On August 27, 1928, Kellogg-Briand Pact, otherwise called the Pact of Paris, among the rules of public international law, registered the prohibition of war as a means of national politics to regulate the differences or conflicts between states. As a fundamental right, prohibiting the use of force or threat to use of force in international law was inserted as a peremptory norm of jus cogens gentium in 1945. That is, peremptory norm from which no derogation is permissible. So, war is not permitted under international law, to the adoption of United Nations Charter. Regarding the study of human behavior, we can say that it has been of interest since ancient times that primitive village in a battle where victory was often interrupted by the carnage. To that time, honor during the struggle meant to win or die. Even if we speak of the primitive, study shows that there were certain rules of fighting the battle. We can talk about rules such as warning the opponent before the attack, time of preparation, the use of weapons, more or less complicated, the conditions for the truce, etc., etc. Given the fact that life in ancient times was closely linked to superstition, the moments in which the rules referred to were born are most probably related to superstition, that the gods could revenge. In its evolution, the society in its form of slavery as higher form of organization developed the relationship between communities. The most telling evidence of the kind shown above is Hammurabi's code, the king of Babylon who created this code. Another example of tolerance towards the enemy can be found in the Old Testament teachings that in this respect it is recommended that Jews do not kill the enemy who surrenders and be compassionate to the wounded women and children. The distinguishing feature of the period, that is 1500 BC and 476 AD, is the collapse of the Roman Empire, is the isolation of communities and a sense of mutual hostility. It concludes that the war was the only way of forced closeness between states. In the next period, the Roman Empire was thriving. That means Roman was highlighted by organization, force, but especially as a very advanced law system. We meet two concepts of law, that is, jus naturally, that is only for the citizens of Rome, and jus gentium, which is applicable to foreigners living in Rome. Later, the doctrine by Cicero and Seneca proclaims equality between men and denounced slavery, which means that the promotion of humanistic spirit cannot be removed. It is the written early stage that urges states to respect laws and tolerance. Marcus Aurelius raises the standards of humanism through his famous words. For me, in my capacity as emperor, Rome is my city and my country. In my capacity as a human being, I have the entire world as a country. What is good for these two societies may be the only good thing for me. Even if the declaratory humanism was already a flourishing period, we cannot find the cruelty with which Romans sometimes acted. It should be noted, the Edict of Milan, during which the Emperor Constantine, known as an alliance between church and state, and as a corollary of this is preaching love of neighbor. Not long after, St. Augustine, at the beginning of the 5th century, launches the famous theory of just war. The collapse of the Roman Empire makes room for a new state organization, namely those of Slavic and Germanic origins. We should note that regarding part of the customs and rules were maintained, other rules being added to these ones. Basically, we are witnessing the period when the first legal rules of fighting the war appeared. The Middle Ages began with many armed conflicts both within countries and between them, so that it has been appreciated at a time that war is the law of feudalism. It manifests itself slowly humanistic principles influenced mainly by religious doctrine contrary to the state hostility. The same religion changes later the meaning of doctrine, giving to the suffering of a mystical and educational value. Finally, we mention the fact that scientific research shows that in the period that followed, the right war could no longer grow. Among the causes for this fact was the struggle between the papacy and the kings. On the other hand, the absence of the concept of sovereign and independent state. The beginning of the 15th century, coinciding with the advent of firearms, overturns the whole theory of art of war, and consequently it influences the humanistic ideas. During this period appears the natural law theory, a theory which condemns unnecessary sufferings. The legitimacy of war has no divine origin. One can find in this period the ideologies of Nicholas Machiavelli and in particular Hugo Grotius, the latter being considered the father of international law and especially an illustrious representative of natural law. Grotius considered that the war right doesn't exist because the war is an anti-social and anti-legal act. His major idea is that it may be permissible when it is called war, but the humanitarian rules must be respected. With the decline of pontifical power in the end of 16th century, modern states were formed. Their relations are governed by legal rules. Concepts such as cartels and capitulations appear. These are agreements between the military chiefs of the warring states. The ideas of natural law influence the Knights' orders, being amplified during the Enlightenment philosophy. Taking into account that the current civilization, when they became aware of the sufferings of the neighbor, they were taken in the war plan right, issuing two major principles, namely necessity and principle of humanitarianism. To understand the purpose of the international humanitarian law as it was conceived in ancient times, we must assume that it is designed as a protection against the challenges of increasing bloody humanity in action at the man. It is also implemented as a rational measure which gives hope to master the forces of a fatal aberration. The evolution of increasingly cruel threats and dangers towards the man determined to find ways and means to curb such excessiveness and army violence which have appeared since ancient times. The course of the war, manifested as military activity, has always determined great loss of lives, and because of this, state of peace as a state of normality requires more self-evident. However, due to simple socio-psychological analysis, we should note that other state could actually cause mass destruction. Consequently, we must not understand that the international humanitarian law is a substitute for peace, but a set of rules for the protection of human rights and fundamental freedoms of man, and more accurate, as the French jurist Jean Piaget said, a respect to the human person and its flowering. The states, since their emergence as entities, in the simple virtue of their existence, came into certain relationship between them, often not necessarily friendly. The desire for expansion of hegemony led to the so-called deepening relations between them and led to bloody conflicts. History has shown that between the countries of the world, since ancient times, relations were manifested in two main forms, namely cooperation and struggle. The collaboration relations as they are known today, even if they initially had an empirical form, are governed by legal rules, rules of public international law, while those similar to struggle are part of the rules that make up the international humanitarian law. The first time the concept of public international law came into specialized language as a right war, having two meanings, and jus ad bellum, which refers to rules on the use of armed force by states, and jus in bello refers to the rules applicable in relations between parties in armed conflict. The time reference, which codified rules for the protection of persons hors de combat and those who did not take direct part in the war, was in 1863. The creation of the International Committee of the Red Cross, at which point jus in bello was divided into two branches, the law of war and the humanitarian law. Also, in terms of terminology, it is necessary to recall that the late 19th century and early 20th century has coincided with a series of conferences in the field coding the rules which enshrine in the light of war as the laws of customs of war. In conclusion, we may say a major part of international humanitarian law is contained in the 4 Geneva Conventions of 1949, which we discussed earlier, which have been adopted by all nations in the world. The conventions have been developed and supplemented by 2 further agreements. The additional protocols of 1977 relating to the protection of victims of armed conflicts and the 2005 additional protocol 3 relating to the adoption of an additional distinctive emblem. Along with the Hague Conventions of 1899 and 1907, international humanitarian law forbids the use of weapons and tactics that cause unnecessary suffering to combatants and non-combatants alike. International humanitarian law reflects the basic principles of distinction, proportionality and precaution. Thank you.